Alrighty, time for a quick book review. This is another one that I, surprisingly, got in a subscription box. And I was actually super excited to read this because it's based on Indian mythology. And I tend to love all things mythology, legends. That's totally my jam. So I was super excited to pick this up. And I should preface this with saying that this is not like a mythological realm. These are not myths that I am familiar with. So I cannot actually speak to how accurate this retelling of the story is. However, I just want to note I read a lot of reviews on Goodreads that were very critical in that regard, but check that out for yourself. So all I can speak to is this book, not how it compares to the original story. And I have to say I ended up not liking this as much as I thought I would. So as you can tell from the title Goddess of the River, the book is about the goddess of the river, and we follow her story coming to Earth, and then she is like tricked into cursed into becoming human, and then she becomes a deity again. We follow that whole thing. And for, I want to say about 2/3, that's super interesting because that's the journey we follow. And I, for the most part, enjoyed that quite a lot, even though I will say that the goddess was a bit whiny and annoying at times, especially if you consider, well, you're a goddess, get a grip. But okay, I'll let that slide. I was invested in the story at that point, and then we sort of changed tunes a bit. There is a point in the story where the goddess has children, and about 2/3 through, we suddenly focus on one of those children. So we now have 2 points of views. We have chapters from 2 points of views. We have some from the goddess and some from her son. And the thing is, we also start jumping through time now. So we follow her son's life, but not in chronological order. So there might be a chapter where he's just a kid, then now we have a chapter where he's an old man, and then now we have a chapter where he's a young man, and it just keeps going back and forth. And with like chapters from her point of view interspersed. And the thing is, that is already very confusing to just make sense of, like, okay, where are we now time-wise? Like, where in the story? I feel like this obviously would be easier to follow if you are familiar with the story, because then with the myth, because then you know what's happening. But as I said, I'm not familiar with it, so that was very confusing. And another issue that I will admit was caused by me also not being familiar with the story is there are a lot of characters introduced, and a lot of those characters have extremely, extremely similar names. And it is very difficult to keep track of who is who and who is doing what, because we jump through time so much. So, if this were more linear, you would have characters introduced at a more like normal pace, I'll say, and it would be easier to figure out, okay, this person is that, this is how they relate to each other, and before, more people come in. But because we're just keep going back and forth, you have 10 people who all have some version of the same name. It is so difficult to keep track of who is who and who is doing what, which is just making everything more complicated on top of the jumping through time bits. And I just found that very taxing as a reader, because you just spend the last third of the book being super confused. And it has to do a lot, I think, with the pacing of the book, because as I said, this happens in the last third. So we have a lot of story that is being told there, and we're just speeding through all the events of decades worth of a person's life. So we're just breezing through all of this, and just everything is thrown your way, and you're just desperately trying to somehow figure things out, make sense of it, which is difficult. So I found that somewhat irritating to read, and I was also a bit sad because at that point the titular goddess sort of falls to the wayside, because she doesn't really have a storyline anymore. Before it was her story, and now it's just certain events that she just sort of adjacently witnesses. At that point, it just becomes the story of her son. Sometimes she's, I don't know, like standing there, like observing what's going on. Okay, which it just makes for very odd pacing and storytelling, and just the shift in focus was odd to only then compress all of that so densely with jumping across different points in time and just throwing in so many characters that as a reader it is so difficult to keep up. And I really wanted to like this. As I said, I love mythology, but this just made for sort of irritating reading, because now it just felt like such an exercise, such a chore to try and keep track of this whole universe, like what is going on, because nothing has enough time for you to actually grasp who those people are, to give them any depth to, sort of cement them in your brain. And that, sort of disappointed me. So for like 2/3, I really was on board, and then the author, unfortunately lost me. And as I said, I'm not familiar with the original myth, but I did see that a lot of people who are really criticized the book a lot on that front on Goodreads. I cannot speak to that, but I would advise to maybe also look at those reviews before you choose to pick this up, if something more accurate in terms of retelling is what you're in for. I would also assume that, in the original story, things are way less confusing, because the original story is obviously a lot longer. So what I mentioned with, the characters, the people mentioned there, I feel like it wouldn't be so confusing, because you do have the time and the space to actually make sense of things. But as it is, this is definitely not my favorite myth, like, retelling situation. And I feel like this could have been better. It was good for about 2/3, and then sort of didn't love it after that. But those are my thoughts on Goddess of the River. Thanks for watching. Bye.